A couple years ago, Beth and I were with our kids in the car, and we were telling them the story of Jesus when he calms the wind and the waves. We wanted to help them understand that Jesus is always with them, and even in scary situations, Jesus takes care of them. And I'm going to be honest, we're nailing it. Like, we're really communicating well the truth of Jesus. So we finish, and Kylie pauses and says, if Jesus is in my heart, where does he go to the bathroom? And I was like, well, that's not the point. And Hunter goes, oh, does Jiwa pee his pants? We weren't nailing it as much as I had hoped. There are lots of opportunities when Beth and I are talking to the kids, and they'll ask a question about Jesus, and Beth will look at them and say, well, why don't you ask Daddy? He went to seminary, and there's this moment where you're like, because sometimes all that I've studied doesn't cut it when it comes to answering the questions about Jesus for my kids. I think that's what we're hearing in this story, is Jesus, as he's welcoming these children, is reminding us that all the pursuits that we've made into our lives, all the things that we think that we've achieved as grown-up people, don't cut it when it comes to faith. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees before this. He's talking to the religious leaders, and in the middle of that conversation, people begin to bring their kids to him because they know there's something about Jesus that they want their kids to experience. And I'm always amazed by the fact that Jesus turns away from the people of importance to these little children. He says to the crowds, it's in the faith of these children that you will experience the kingdom. And that's why a Sunday like this is so important in the life of our church. Not just because it puts the kids up front and we can celebrate what they do, that's an important thing, but because there is something about the very nature of being a child that we are called to emulate in our faith. As the story starts, Jesus has been doing this teaching and preaching, and the people are coming to him, and the disciples stop them. I'm always caught off guard by this idea that the disciples are so off the boat from where Jesus is that the people that Jesus would invite are the very people that the disciples stop. I started to wonder this week how often we as the church act like those disciples. And for some reason, we think that Jesus needs us to protect his time and space, and so we've started to draw lines about who's in and who's out, and who gets included and who doesn't, and who's welcome and who's not. And what we find with Jesus is that we are constantly surprised at the very people that Jesus welcomes into his presence. Church, for too long, we've tried to draw lines and say, you get in and you don't, and you get in and you don't, and that's not our call. We need to have a heart like Jesus to welcome those who've been forgotten. Jesus says you need to have this childlike faith, and I started to think this week, what is it about kids that allow them to know something of Jesus that we don't? I think maybe it's that they ask questions. The thing that happens in my house all the time is somebody's always asking the question, why? And eventually I say, no more questions. Like, you've reached your quota for the day. There are no more questions allowed. And so I read this week, I thought, why do kids ask so many questions? That was my question. Why do they ask so many questions? And there's some development specialists that think that it's not that the kids want the answers, it's that they want the relationship with the one they're asking the questions of. They want to know that you know, even if they don't. We need to be people that learn to ask questions. You see, sometimes I think we become grown-ups, and the questions that we have to face are scarier questions. Like, where were you in the midst of the hurt and the heartbreak and the pain that I experienced? Where were you, God, in the midst of those moments when I needed healing? Why didn't you act in the ways that we had hoped? Sometimes the questions we have to face as grown-ups are much more challenging than we'd care to admit. And so rather than ask those questions, we hold back because we're not sure that God is big enough for our questions. God is compassionate and gracious and patient. Way more compassionate and gracious and patient than we are. And so while my response might be no more questions, I think God invites our questions and invites us to ask the questions that we might dive into the relationship and know the one who holds the answers. This week, we were at the kids' school for a book fair. We were leaving the school, and there was a big rainbow across town on Tuesday. And so I pointed the rainbow out to the kids and said, look, guys, there's a rainbow. And you would have thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened in the history of the world. You know, like there was excitement and wonder and gasping, you know. And I was like, it's not even that good of a rainbow, but okay, you know. So we get home and Hunter busts out of the car and he goes running across the yard because he wants to see if he can see it from our house. He was so excited about the rainbow that he wanted to name our puppy Rainbow, which we nixed. But, you know, it was like this great moment where he just couldn't hold back his exuberance and wonder at this thing in the sky. Sometimes I think kids can grasp that more than we can because as adults, we've turned our wonder into cynicism. And we've begun to stop this idea of wonder and awe, and instead we've become cynical and jaded and uncertain about the world we live in. And rather than standing awe of a God who is creative and beautiful and wonderful and continues to work in our midst, we try and put God into this box that we can somehow understand and comprehend. When was the last time you stood in wonder of a God who creates in vivid, beautiful colors? When was the last time you stood in awe of a God who cares for us with compassion and grace? When was the last time you stood in awe of the stars in the night sky and thought, if God is so big to make that, but he's also so caring that he cares about me? When was the last time, rather than try to control God, you stood in wonder of God? If I would have told my kids that there was a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow on Tuesday, they would have believed me. And they would have been open to that possibility that something better existed. They're open to this possibility that what is right now isn't what always is going to be. And on a regular basis, I have these conversations with my kids where they start like, what if? Like, what if I turned into a dog? You know, like that's not a real thing that's going to happen, but they begin to wonder about it, and they begin to be open to this possibility that maybe something can change, that maybe something can be different. Friends, as people of faith, we are a people who are open to the possibility that the world as we know it is not what it has to be. We live with this hope that someday things will be different than what they are now. And in the midst of that, in the midst of this longing we have for a different kingdom, we realize that what we have today is some assembly required. And we are called to join in with God on bringing about this potential new future that we can see and experience. What if God began to move in our midst in a way we wouldn't anticipate? What if God began to do something that we had never seen before? What if God isn't done with us yet? May we have the faith of a child to welcome, to ask the questions, to stand in awe and wonder at a God who has worked and continues to do so, and to hold out hope for the things that are to come.